I want you to imagine something that, not long ago, seemed almost unthinkable. A Republican-controlled Congress. A Republican president known for enforcing loyalty, and yet open defiance. This week, Donald Trump didn't just lose a vote, he lost two back-to-back. One on healthcare, one on war. For years, the assumption was simple. Trump commands, Republicans comply. Fear, party, survival. The formula seemed airtight. But power in politics is never static. It erodes quietly before it collapses publicly. What happened on Capitol Hill wasn't a rebellion. It was something more revealing. Hesitation, calculation, self-preservation. And when 5 Republican senators crossed the president on military action in Venezuela, Trump's response wasn't persuasion, it was rage. That reaction tells us more than the votes themselves. If you want to understand where American power is actually shifting, not in theory, but in practice, stay with me. Because this story is not about 2 votes. It's about the limits of control. And to see why those limits suddenly matter, we need to step back, much further back, to understand why these defeats matter. We have to be precise about what they are and what they are not. This is not the collapse of a presidency. Donald Trump remains powerful. His vetoes still hold. His party still controls Congress. But power is not binary. It is elastic. And what we witnessed was that elasticity beginning to stretch. In the House, Republicans quietly broke ranks to revive healthcare subsidies they had allowed to expire. Not because they suddenly embraced Democratic ideology, but because healthcare is no longer an abstract policy. It is a voter-level risk. In the Senate, the defection was sharper. War powers cut to the core of presidential authority. When lawmakers invoke Congress's constitutional role, they are not posturing. They are drawing a line. Put simply, Republican lawmakers are starting to ask a different question. Not, what does Trump want? But, what will voters tolerate? That shift changes everything. Because once loyalty becomes conditional, control becomes fragile. And to see how we arrived at this moment, we have to look at the deeper forces that shaped it. To understand those deeper forces, we have to place this moment in context, historical, institutional, and cyclical. For decades, American presidents have expanded their power during moments of fear or urgency. War, crisis, polarization. Congress slowly steps back. The presidency steps forward. Donald Trump did not invent this system. He inherited it. And then he tested its outer limits on trade, on appointments, on military authority. But institutions remember, and they react. In the House, letting healthcare subsidies expire may have aligned with ideology, but it collided with reality. Millions depend on those benefits. Members of Congress depend on those voters. As elections approach, theory gives way to consequence. In the Senate, Venezuela triggered something older and deeper. War powers. Congress has ceded that ground before, but rarely without discomfort. When military action appears legally dubious, hesitation turns into resistance. These are not sudden acts of courage. They are delayed reactions to accumulated pressure. And pressure, once released, rarely stops at one point. The question now is not why this happened. It's why it happened now. And the answer begins with the first real shock. The first shock came quietly, almost bureaucratically, but its implications were explosive. In the House, a Democratic discharge petition succeeded in reviving and extending Affordable Care Act insurance subsidies. This was not supposed to happen. Republicans control the chamber. Leadership sets the agenda. Minority tactics usually die in procedural darkness. And yet, 17 Republicans crossed the line. Not for symbolism, not for headlines, but because the subsidies had expired on January 1, because constituents felt it immediately, and because healthcare punishes abstraction. This vote wasn't about embracing the Affordable Care Act. It was about recognizing a political reality. Letting coverage lapse is not an ideological gesture. It is a tangible harm. What made this moment destabilizing wasn't the policy itself. It was the signal. Republican lawmakers demonstrated that when electoral risk becomes personal, party discipline weakens. If you're trying to understand how power actually erodes, this is where it starts, not with speeches, but with small defections that expose a larger fear. And if this moment caught your attention, pause for a second, share it. These are the details that decide elections long before ballots are cast. But this was only the opening act, because hours later, the Senate delivered something far more dangerous to presidential authority. And that's where the real confrontation began. What followed was not louder, but it was deeper, because beneath these votes sits a mechanism most people overlook: how power actually functions inside a party that fears losing. Trump's authority has always rested on alignment. When his goals matched the political survival of Republican lawmakers, loyalty was easy. Tax cuts, judges, deregulation, the incentives lined up. But misalignment changes behavior. Healthcare exposes members to voter backlash, war powers expose senators to constitutional scrutiny, and Venezuela in particular sits at the intersection of legality, escalation, and uncertainty. When that happens, lawmakers don't rebel theatrically, they defect surgically. The Senate vote to advance a war powers resolution was narrow, symbolic, and limited. But symbolism is not weakness, it is rehearsal. It tests boundaries, it measures consequences. Trump understood that instinctively. His public fury naming and condemning 5 Republican senators was not strength. It was a warning shot. Yet warnings only work when fear outweighs alternatives. As elections approach, that balance shifts. For many Republicans, the greater threat is no longer Trump's anger, it is voter judgment. This is how centralized control erodes, not all at once, but decision by decision. And once this mechanism is in motion, it rarely stops on its own. Which brings us to the second shock: faster, sharper, and far more revealing. The second shock arrived in the Senate, and this time it struck at the heart of presidential power. A bipartisan majority voted to advance a war powers resolution aimed at limiting U.S. military involvement in Venezuela. On paper, it was procedural: a 52-47 vote to begin debate, no tanks withdrawn, no missiles halted. But politically, it was seismic. 5 Republican senators broke with the White House. Not fringe figures, not retiring placeholders, but sitting lawmakers calculating risk in real time. War powers votes are different. They are not about budgets or benefits. They are about authority who decides when America uses force. And for decades, Congress has largely surrendered that authority. This vote signaled discomfort, not just with Venezuela, but with how casually military power was being exercised. The president dismissed the resolution as inconsequential. But then came the reaction, public, personal, and unforgiving. Trump declared those senators should never be elected to office again. That moment revealed the real fracture. Because when a leader treats symbolic dissent as betrayal, it exposes insecurity. Control feels most threatened not by defeat, but by defiance. This wasn't about Venezuela alone. It was about precedent. And once precedent cracks, the pressure spreads outward beyond Capitol Hill into everyday life. Because eventually, these power struggles land somewhere very specific. They land on you, and this is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Because when power slips at the top, the consequences don't stay in Washington. They travel downward. They reach your life. Healthcare subsidies are not talking points. They determine whether people keep coverage, delay treatment, or take on debt they can't afford. When lawmakers hesitated, it wasn't because of ideology. It was because voters felt the costs first. War powers aren't theoretical either. Military escalation carries human, economic, and moral weight. When Congress questions that authority, it's often because the public senses something drifting off course. And you feel that drift as uncertainty, higher anxiety, lower trust, What's unfolding now is a quiet renegotiation between leaders and the led. Lawmakers are reading signals from polls, from town halls, from the fatigue of constant crisis. If you've ever felt that politics no longer listens, this moment matters because it shows that pressure still works slowly, imperfectly, but persistently. If this analysis resonates, pause for a moment. Share it. Conversations like this are how influence moves, not through outrage, but understanding. Because what's happening inside America's institutions doesn't stop at its borders. It ripples outward. And next, we need to look at how this shift is already being felt around the world. What happens inside the US Congress never stays inside the US Congress. Allies watch these moments closely. Adversaries even more so. Because congressional resistance sends a signal about continuity, credibility, and constraint. On Venezuela, the message was unmistakable. America's military posture is no longer just a presidential decision. It is contested. That uncertainty shapes how other governments calculate risk, whether to escalate, negotiate, or wait. More broadly, the image of a president struggling to enforce unity inside his own party weakens bargaining power abroad. Foreign leaders don't just ask what the White House wants. They ask whether it can deliver. This matters in a world already defined by fragmentation. When US authority looks divided, power vacuums open. Regional actors push boundaries. Conflicts linger longer. Diplomacy slows. And it's not just security. Healthcare votes signal something else globally. Domestic instability constrains foreign ambition. Governments preoccupied with internal fractures project less confidence externally. None of this means American power disappears, but it becomes conditional, negotiated, slower. The world adjusts accordingly. And that brings us to the hardest question of all, not what is happening now, but what happens next. Because from here, there are only a few possible paths forward. From here, the future narrows into a small number of plausible paths. And none of them are neutral. The first scenario is containment. Trump absorbs these setbacks, tightens discipline, and Republicans fall back into line. Symbolic rebellions fade. The system resets. Power holds, but at a cost. Trust erodes quietly, even as order appears restored. The second scenario is drift. This is the most likely. Lawmakers don't revolt, they hesitate. Votes like these recur narrowly, inconsistently. Trump remains president, but his authority becomes situational. On healthcare, on war, on trade, loyalty becomes conditional, governance slows. Signals blur. The third scenario is fracture. As midterm pressure intensifies, self-preservation overtakes party unity. More Republicans defect, not dramatically, but enough to matter. The presidency still commands attention, but no longer obedience. History suggests something important here. Systems rarely collapse from confrontation. They weaken through calculation, through actors deciding that the old rules no longer protect them. Which path emerges depends less on Trump and more on incentives, on elections, on fear, on voters. And that brings us to the final insight. Because in moments like this, the most important force is not power at the top. It's pressure from below. Here is the final insight, and it is both simpler and more unsettling than it appears. Donald Trump did not suddenly lose control. What he lost was certainty. The certainty that his demands would be obeyed automatically. The certainty that fear would always outweigh consequence. The certainty that institutions would keep yielding. The votes you've just seen were small, procedural, symbolic, and that is precisely why they matter. They show that power is now being negotiated, not assumed. When a president reacts to dissent with threats rather than persuasion, it signals a shift, not in authority on paper, but in confidence in practice. As midterm elections approach, this pressure will intensify. Lawmakers will calculate, voters will signal, and loyalty will continue to compete with survival. This story isn't about Trump alone. It's about how systems behave under stress, and how democracies test their limits without announcing it. If you want to understand what comes next in American politics, don't just watch the White House. Watch the margins, watch the defections, watch the moments that seem small. Because history doesn't usually turn on landslides. It turns on cracks. If this analysis helped you see those cracks more clearly, subscribe, share, and stay with me. The next chapter is already forming. And we'll be here to break it down before everyone else does.